Ladies and gentlemen, Senator George McGovern.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be at Lincoln's 200th birthday, right in the heart of Washington, D.C., and with the members of the Lincoln Group for the District of Columbia. I'm still one of those people, maybe going against the present trends, who thinks that Washington is a great city and a great place to be. And I'm pleased to be in the presence of three Lincoln scholars. You've just heard from Mr. Simons, whom we all admire, and Mr. Holzer, also at my table. Mr. Borth, where are you sitting? Right over here. And we really didn't need me here as a speaker tonight with all this talent. I want to say to Mr. Simons that I congratulate him for his courage as a young naval officer cruising around the exalted places of the Navy with the McGovern sticker. I wish I could tell you that I had a chance once and came very close to joining the Navy. After Pearl Harbor, there were 10 guys who were classmates of mine at this little college at Dakota Wesleyan, and we had all taken a course in civilian pilot training, CPT, I think it was called. And so after Pearl Harbor, we all wanted to sign up. There wasn't any Air Force then. There was just the Naval Air Corps and the Army Air Corps. Which one to join? We talked about it. In those days, no college student had a car. This was at the end of the Depression. So we borrowed one car from the president of the school and one from the Navy and took off for Omaha, where the two recruiting stations were for the Army and the Navy in our region. And we were talking about which service we should go in. When we got there, one of the guys picked up a rumor that if you went to the Army Air Corps recruiting station, they'd give you a free meal ticket to a cafeteria in downtown Omaha. So on the strength of that unsubstantiated rumor, and a meal ticket that was probably worth about $1 at that time, all 10 of us joined the Army Air Corps. So I have to say, Mr. Simon, that that's probably the cheapest I've ever sold out. Anyway, Abraham Lincoln, in my opinion, was our greatest president. I believed that in 1972 when I thought that office. I'm an even stronger believer of that point of view. And the book that I have recently written is one that gave me more pleasure than any of the things I've ever written. The discovery of different things about Lincoln was its own reward. I hadn't intended to write a book at that time, but I ran into Arthur Schlesinger, the great political historian, in New York one day, and he told me about this presidential series they're doing, a book on the presidency, not necessarily a full-scale biography, although it was all right to provide enough background on the individual, but primarily a book on the presidencies of all of our presidents, beginning with Washington, coming down to the present time. And each one would have a different author. And he spoke to me about doing one of those books. I said, Arthur, I'm working on a project with Bob Dole to get the UN, with the United States in the lead, to provide a good, nutritious lunch every day for every hungry school child in the world. And I said, that's a full responsibility. I'm not going to have time to write a book. He said, oh, come on, George. You always been telling me how much better Northwestern is than Harvard. And you can knock that book out in a year or so. I said, well, I'm not really eager to do it, but if I could get Lincoln, I might do it. He said, too bad. Bill Clinton has already spoken for Abraham Lincoln. He said, this may surprise you, George, but in some quarters, they think a guy who actually reached the White House has done more than somebody who was just nominated, particularly if that guy lost 49 states. And they, despite the high intelligence of people like Mr. Simon. But anyway, a year and a half later, Bill Clinton said he just couldn't do that book, so I inherited it. And I'm glad it worked out that way. It was just a genuine pleasure to do this work on Lincoln. He was a remarkable human being, in addition to being a great president. As Mr. Simon pointed out, he had a sense of humor, and we frequently saw evidence of that, sometimes in political discourse. He loved to tell stories, some of them with a humorous application, but one of my favorites, he was in a debate with an opponent who accused him of being two-faced. Is he for slavery or is against it? What is his position on the public lands and so on? The man is two-faced. So when it came Lincoln's turn to reply, he said, does the gentleman really think that if God had given me two faces, I'd be wearing this ugly one that I have on today? That's what I call humor with a purpose, and Lincoln had a lot of it. But paradoxically, he suffered from what we today would call clinical depression through many periods of his life. He called it melancholy. His law partner said when he walked across the office, the melancholy fairly dripped from his being. And he would go into these spells of depression that would have almost paralyzed the ordinary person. They didn't have lithium in those days, or they didn't have Paxil. They didn't have electric shock therapy. Lincoln had to carry that burden without effective medical help. I can tell you that depression is a terrible affliction. You lose your appetite, you lose your interest in any particular endeavor. You feel as though it would be better to die than to continue with that depression. And Lincoln frequently considered suicide, even as a young man. He once told one of his fellow state legislators at Springfield that he no longer carried a knife for fear he might slash his wrists or his throat and end his life in one of these terrible moments of depression. Indirectly, we lost one of our 4 daughters to depression, which she medicated with alcohol, became an alcoholic, and died from it. So it's a terrible affliction, and it's one of the reasons I admire Lincoln, that he carried that burden, frequently telling jokes, frequently spinning yarns, speaking in parables sometimes to make a point. He did all of that without medical help, and I think it's one measure of the great strength of this man. And then, as Mr. Simons pointed out, here you have a man of peace. Lincoln honestly believed that you could solve any problem with reason and with common sense. He didn't think there was any problem that faced human beings that they couldn't either surmount or learn to live with if they only would apply their mental and God-given faculties to deal with the problem. And so he had this terrible war on his shoulders for 4 years. I think he made one mistake in that war. He lifted the writ of habeas corpus. That is one of our great legal rights in this country. It's pledged in the law, and I think that was a mistake. I know that in time of war, any president's probably tempted to take shortcuts to do various things that wouldn't happen in peacetime, but that's why we need these protections in time of war as well as in time of peace. I think it was a mistake to close down several newspapers that were critical of the administration. I can understand why a president would be tempted to do that, particularly if you're being battered this way and that by negative criticism at a time when you're trying to lead the nation to a successful conclusion of a terrible war. But those, if there were any faults in Lincoln, and I hesitate to mention anything, he was such a marvelous human being. I think it was that, like sometimes other presidents did things that were ill-advised at the time, I would wager that if Franklin Roosevelt could come back to this life, he would say it was a mistake to round up all the Japanese citizens in this country who had become American citizens or were working at good constructive jobs. There's never been one shred of evidence that any one of those people who, in a sense, were put into concentration camps simply because they happened to have originated in Japan. So it's easy to see that mistakes like that are made in time of war. But as I look at Lincoln's record, I don't know how anyone else during this difficult period could have done better. He had this terrible problem with generals who just wouldn't carry the battle. They might score a victory, but then they'd let the enemy lope off without any pursuit. At one time, he was so disgusted with the generals that he seriously considered taking leave from his post in the White House and taking command of one of the divisions in order to show other generals what he had in mind for a war. So he had very difficult problems to deal with. This problem of the South was very difficult. Lincoln did, I think, almost everything a president could do to head off the secession of the southern states. That was partly what he had in mind when he told the South, I'm not going to touch slavery in the South. I don't have the constitutional power to deal with slavery in the South, but I want it understood there will be no slavery in the federal territories that were open for peoples to settle and turn into future states. Slavery, in other words, had gone as far as it was going to go, and Lincoln made that clear.